Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's CAQH Core webinar, A Physician's Perspective on the Value of Operating Rules. We're really happy to be joined today by Dr. Marilyn Heine, who I'll introduce and give you some more background on in just a minute. But before we go ahead and get started, I will just go over a few brief logistics on the next slide. If you'd like to access today's webinar materials, we will be sending out an email to everyone who attended and registered in the next 1 to 2 business days. You'll be able to access both a copy of the slides and a recording of today's presentation. If you have a question at any time, please feel free to submit it throughout the presentation in your menu on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a questions panel there, and we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So we'll be taking a look at your questions as they come through. I'm briefly going to go over our agenda for today. We'll start out with a brief overview of CORE. We'll provide some context on state of the industry and adoption of electronic standards. We'll then talk a bit about operating rules and give a brief overview on what they are and how we use them. And then we'll pass things over to Dr. Heine, who will give us an overview on the American Medical Association. From there, we'll be going over operating rules and some case examples on how they are used in the real world, how they might be used from a provider organization perspective. We'll wrap things up afterwards with a call to action and, like I mentioned before, a brief Q&A for our speakers. Before I pass things over to Erin, I do want to introduce our speaker for today. We're really excited to be joined by Dr. Marilyn Heine today, who will highlight how crucial operating rules are for provider organizations. She is an emergency medicine and hematology oncology physician in Southeast Pennsylvania and a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at Drexel University College of Medicine in Philadelphia. In 2022, she was elected to the American Medical Association Board of Trustees and represents the AMA on our core board. She's acclaimed for her contributions to health policy and is recognized as a tenacious advocate and leader for physicians and patients alike. Marilyn, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for offering your perspective on how operating rules help providers, ultimately helping us reach, our common goal of improving the patient experience overall.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Great. With that, I'm going to pass things over to Erin Weber to get us started.
Great, thanks Jackie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Erin Weber and I am the Vice President of CORE at CAQH. Just a little background about CORE and CAQH. CAQH is a nonprofit organization with a mission to streamline the business of healthcare, and within that umbrella we have a suite of products that reduce burden for both plans and providers to support credentialing, coordination of benefits, directory maintenance, among other things. We have a research arm, and I'll be sharing some of that research today, most known for the CAQH Index, which tracks annual industry adoption of electronic transactions, but puts out an array of issue briefs and other papers throughout the year with great data on really the path to automation in our industry. And then what I'm here to talk to you about today, and Dr. Heine as well, is CORE, which is our Committee on Operating Rules for Information Exchange. CORE was founded shortly, probably like 2005, 2006 time range, shortly after HIPAA had passed. There were requirements in HIPAA for plans and providers to start using electronic standards to exchange common healthcare data like claims, eligibility inquiries, remittance advice. But what happened was, as organizations started to implement those transactions electronically, the standard still allowed for some variation. So from a provider perspective, the information that they may receive on an eligibility response from one health plan differed from another health plan, which made it difficult to automate systems. And really the only requirement for eligibility was to send back yes or no, this patient is eligible, which doesn't add a lot of value, and there's a lot more information in that transaction that can be exchanged. So the industry came together and created CORE. We are a multi-stakeholder industry collaborative of a little more than 100 organizations, plans, providers, vendors, clearinghouses, associations, and others who come together to develop consensus-based operating rules, which are really business rules that build on the standard transactions. So eligibility was the first set of operating rules that CORE ever developed, and those requirements first required that eligibility transaction include information around what services the patient is eligible for, what are the patient's financial responsibilities, their copay, their deductible, and the operating rules actually require eligibility to be conducted in real time, which today seems like a no-brainer because we're all used to that. But back then, it was very inconsistent. And so operating rules can really put some guardrails around these standards to help create more uniformity and consistency across the industry. In 2012, we were designated as the National Operating Rule Authoring Entity under HIPAA. So some of our operating rules, especially those for eligibility, claim status, and payment and remittance advice, are federally mandated under HIPAA. Other sets of our operating rules are available for voluntary implementation. We also have a certification program with over 400 certifications awarded to date, and that allows organizations to demonstrate their conformance with the operating rules. I think what's really unique and cool about CORE is that it's one place where plans and providers come together and really try to work towards solutions. Everything we do is technology and standard agnostic, which means that anyone in the industry can adopt them to support the exchange of transactions. Next slide. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on where we are as an industry in terms of automation using findings from our CAQH index report. And then Marilyn's going to share some information about the AMA and their perspective. Our most recent index report includes data from 2021, and that report found that the medical industry is spending about $55 billion to conduct these administrative transactions, and you can see them listed on this slide. They really range the entire revenue cycle annually. The opportunity for savings, and when we calculate savings opportunity, we think of if every single one of these transactions, and you can see there are literally billions of them, were conducted electronically using a standard transaction, how much would the industry save? And that amount last year was $22.3 billion. So there's definitely opportunity for improvement. The bottom of this slide shows the volume of transactions, and you can see eligibility and benefit verification far outpaces all of the other transactions that we see here. It is used quite a bit, and it is increasingly used. We're seeing this volume increase over time. Because it is so high volume, the savings associated with eligibility and benefits is also quite high. On the next slide, we look at each transaction separately and how the volume or how the electronic adoption has changed over the past 3 years. So you can see we have several transactions that are quite highly electronic and have really been holding steady for a couple years now. Acknowledgements and claim submissions. Although some of you may know that CORE is actually working on operating rules for the claim. And that's because even if a claim is submitted electronically, it doesn't mean it's always approved on the first pass. So there's still challenges within the industry around denials and things like that, that the operating rules can also help with. So it's not just about making the transaction electronic, but how can we ensure that the claim is clean and accepted by the health plan? Obviously, there's 2 transactions here that are a little bit lower than the rest. That's prior authorization and attachments. And I know Dr. Heine is going to have a lot to say about that in a few minutes, but those are challenging transactions for providers in particular. They create a lot of burden, in part because they are so highly manual today. On the next slide, we look at some trends over time. Let's take a look at the first graph, which is the medical transaction volume. So this includes all of those transactions you saw from eligibility to claims to payment. And you can see over time, we are using more and more of these transactions, and it continues to increase over time. There was a dip, obviously, in 21 related to the COVID pandemic when there were less less services provided, but that jumped right back up in this past year. When you look at the spend associated with that, you can see the increase from 2021 to 2022. Part of that is because of the COVID pandemic, right? We provided less services in 2021, and that's really 2020 data, and then that kind of rebounded over the past couple years. The other reason the spend has increased so dramatically is twofold. One is it is because of increased volumes for eligibility transactions and prior authorization. So that's really driving up the cost, as well as staffing challenges at physician offices. So we all know that providers are really challenged in finding staff. And so staff that are managing these transactions may not be as well trained and efficient as they were a few years ago. So it's taking them a bit longer to do an eligibility inquiry. And so that is attributing to rising costs as well. Finally, you can see because of all of this, the cost savings opportunity also continues to rise. So even though we keep moving to being more automated, because of volumes and costs, the savings opportunity continues to increase. Next slide. So this is where operating rules come into play. Operating rules are defined in the Affordable Care Act as the necessary business rules and guidelines for the exchange of information, not defined by a standard or its implementation specifications. So again, operating rules are really just an enhancement to standards. They can't conflict with the standards, they can't duplicate what's in a standard, they can just help drive greater automation and more adoption. And you can see here we have 8 sets of core operating rules today that really span the entire healthcare revenue cycle, starting from when a patient visit is scheduled using eligibility and benefits, all the way through payment and remittance. And even we have 2 sets of operating rules related to the management of health plan membership. So transactions that flow between a broker or an employer in the health plan to enroll beneficiaries and provide premium payments. 3 sets of our operating rules are federally mandated, as I mentioned, and others I'll provide some updates on that in a minute. Next slide. So a question we get often is, how are operating rules developed? I mentioned we have about, I think it's 110 organizations that participate with CORE to develop the operating rules. And we really have a robust process to ensure that any requirements come out are highly supported by all stakeholders across the industry and developed in a consensus-based way. CORE has a small staff. We see our role as facilitators of this process. Everyone in our work groups, they're volunteers. They have other full-time jobs. So we try to make it as easy as possible to develop the operating rules. The first step is really to identify opportunities, and we'll do that through interviews with industry experts and our participating organizations. We'll do industry surveys. We may form an advisory group of subject matter experts to understand where the pain points are and if it is an opportunity for an operating rule to help solve. Then we will begin work groups. So we'll put out a call for participants, and anyone from a participating organization can join. Each organization gets 1 vote, and the operating rule requirements are voted and discussed through multiple meetings and polling as we go through the process. This really ensures that we hear everyone's voice, whether or not they can attend a call, they can submit comments on a poll. The process is really inclusive. And then we have a formal balloting process with quorum and approval requirements at each level, ultimately going to our CORE board of directors, which Dr. Heine is on, who have the final approval. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heine to talk about the AMA, her role there, and their thoughts on some of these topics.
Thank you so much, Erin. Before we further explore the operating rules and present clinical cases that demonstrate their value, we thought it would be helpful to provide an introduction to the American Medical Association, or AMA, and why the issues we are addressing here are so important to practicing physicians. Next slide. The AMA is a professional association of physicians and medical students. The AMA's mission is to promote the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. The AMA was founded in 1847, is headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, and has an office in Washington, D.C. The AMA publishes the Journal of the American Medical Association, leads the current procedural terminology coding system, and establishes the AMA Code of Medical Ethics. Uniquely, AMA policy is developed by a House of Delegates that includes representation from over 190 organizations, including state medical associations, national medical specialty societies, and others such as federal services, including the Public Health Service. Next slide. As the AMA convenes the House of Delegates and collaborates with state medical associations and national medical specialty societies, the AMA represents physicians with a unified voice. The AMA's strategic plan is comprised of 3 arcs. These are driving the future of medicine through medical education and professional development, improving health outcomes, and, as we will discuss today, removing obstacles that interfere with patient care, such as those related to prior authorization. Principles of equity, innovation, and advocacy are central to these endeavors. Next slide. In response to the pandemic's adverse effects on physician practices, the AMA developed a recovery plan for America's physicians with 5 focus areas. 2 of these relate to our presentation today: tackling prior authorization and reducing physician burnout. Many of you may be familiar with prior authorization from care that you or a loved one required, or that you tried to arrange for a patient, or from the media. Prior authorization is a process where insurance companies review and potentially deny medical services and pharmaceuticals prior to treatment. This utilization management policy remains a principal frustration for patients and physicians. It is overused, costly, opaque, burdensome to physicians, and harmful to patients, such as denying or delaying their care. Administrative burdens that deny or delay necessary patient care are major contributors to physician burnout. We believe that implementation of the operating rules for information exchange that we will discuss in this session will help streamline prior authorization and lessen physician burnout. To learn more about the recovery plan, please see the QR code on the slide. Next slide. The AMA has conducted surveys of physicians to assess the magnitude of prior authorization requirements that health insurers impose on physician practices. The 2022 survey of 1,001 physicians found that prior authorization requirements are frequent. On average, each physician completed 45 prior authorization requests per week, and opaque. 62% of physicians reported it's difficult to determine whether a medical service or pharmaceutical requires prior authorization. Next slide. Among other critical concerns highlighted in the AMA's 2022 survey, 94% of physicians reported that prior authorization delayed access to necessary care. 33% reported that prior authorization led to a serious adverse event for a patient in their care, including hospitalization, permanent impairment, or death. 80% said patients abandoned treatment due to authorization struggles with health insurers. To learn more about the survey results, please see the QR code on the slide. Next slide. Growing evidence links practice burdens to professional burnout for physicians and other healthcare professionals. Recent studies have shown a huge spike in burnout among practicing physicians. In a 2021 survey, 63% of physicians reported burnout. This is a sharp increase after several years of decline. 1 in 5 physicians said they plan to leave the profession within the next 2 years. This underscores the importance of addressing administrative burdens. Next slide. The AMA supports CORE to have a seat at the table to provide the physician perspective as operating rules are developed and updated. We recognize that CORE rules impact administrative processes for physician practices. The AMA has long advocated for the adoption of electronic transaction and code set standards and operating rules to reduce administrative burdens for physicians and their staff, and to promote uniform communication between practices and the many health plans with which they do business. Administrative processes impact physician practices' efficiency and viability. Any requirements that are imposed should result in decreased administrative burden, improved return on investment, and better business processes. This is particularly important since many physicians, especially those who work in small or rural practices or who serve minoritized and marginalized communities, face challenges in updating their health IT systems due to limited resources. Once implemented, effective rules can help physicians maximize our focus on patient care. Today, we will discuss a 4-part rule package and clinical scenarios that show the value of these rules. This includes important updates to operating rules for eligibility and benefits, system availability requirements or infrastructure, and information security or connectivity, and a new operating rule for patient attribution, key to value-based care. These updated and new operating rules are currently voluntary. The AMA advocated through a comment letter and oral testimony to the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, or NCVHS, that is an advisory body to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that these operating rules should be adopted. NCVHS then recommended adoption of the 4 rules we will discuss today. We look forward to the forthcoming regulations to advance their implementation since they address unmet business needs, help ensure interoperability, and represent important advances for the industry. Next slide. I'll pass it off to Erin.
Great, thank you, Marilyn. So if we move to the next slide, we just heard a great intro to some of the operating rules that have been recently recommended by the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, or NCVHS, for federal adoption. And this slide really gives you kind of the how the bill becomes a law perspective of operating rules and our role as the National Operating Rule authoring entity. The CORE board determines which sets of rules we want to move forward for potential federal mandate. And the process is for the board to send a letter to NCVHS, which is an advisory committee to HHS, proposing new or updated operating rules for federal adoption. That letter will trigger a process through NCVHS where they will put out a request for comments, and they will hold a hearing where they hear feedback from industry stakeholders on the value of the proposed rules. Most recently, this happened over the past year. CORE sent a letter in May of last year, and then NCVHS collected feedback and held a hearing in January of this year. And then in June, they sent a letter to the Secretary of HHS recommending a set of proposed operating rules for adoption. And I'll go through those in a minute. Once NCVHS sends that letter to the Secretary, then HHS typically, assuming they agree with the recommendation, will issue an interim final rule to the industry with a public comment period. Now, I was just attending a virtual NCVHS meeting yesterday where the CMS Office of National Standards Group director, who is that is the group responsible for writing these rules, mentioned that they are working on this rule and we should expect to see it very soon. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the list of rules that NCVHS did recommend to HHS. They include, and we'll go over these in more detail in a minute, but updates to our eligibility and benefits data content rule, a new rule related to patient attribution and value-based contracts, updates to our infrastructure rules, and an updated connectivity rule. On the prior side, there was also a link. We do have a new webpage available for organizations looking to learn more about these rules, with some overview fact sheets and a pre-recorded webinar going into more detail as well. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're now going to go back and forth a little bit. We actually did this at a presentation at HIMSS earlier this year, and it was kind of fun. Because sometimes when those of us that work at CORE or are kind of more on the technology side of things, you don't always think about the impact that your work has on the day-to-day experience of a physician or a patient. And so Dr. Heine does a great job of bringing in that perspective. So what we're going to do next is walk through each of the proposed rules at a very high level. I will do that, and then Dr. Heine will talk about what that means kind of in the real world. So the first we're going to talk about is eligibility and benefits. Now that inquiry is electronic. It's sent from a provider to a health plan to help understand the patient's coverage and benefits associated with that plan, and the plan then responds. So it's a request and a response transaction. We have a set of operating rules, and in particular, a data content rule that requires the submission and return of certain information in real time, I mentioned before, and some detailed benefit information and patient financial information. The most recent updates to the core operating rules, which are included in the updated data content rule that has been recommended by NCVHS, expands the services that are included in this rule, so more robust information on these patient financials and coverage details. It includes requirements to provide more detail on tiered benefits and other complex benefit design. There's requirements to provide eligibility detail at the procedure code level for certain key service lines, as well as information on telemedicine coverage. And finally, information on whether or not a prior authorization is required, so that a provider would know before or at the time of service if a prior auth is required for a service that they are inquiring about, or a procedure, given there'll now be information at that level. So I'll turn it over now for our real world example.
Yeah, thank you. So let's consider an example to show the importance of the updated operating rule for eligibility and benefits. So we'll have someone whom we'll call Mrs. Baker, who calls to schedule a telehealth appointment. And Dr. Smith needs to know if telehealth is, if it's a covered service and if it requires prior authorization. So since the health plan's information is unclear, Dr. Smith's practice must use phone or proprietary portals. And as a result, Mrs. Baker's care is delayed. Now, nearly every patient encounter with a physician or other healthcare professional begins with a confirmation of the patient's insurance, benefits, and specific details of coverage. From the physician's perspective, the true value of conducting a real-time eligibility transaction is getting real-time benefit details in order to provide the information to the patient and proceed with scheduling care. Physicians and other healthcare professionals should be able to interact with all health plans using the same transaction standard set and same format to derive cost savings and improved efficiency from the standardization. Next slide. The updated eligibility and benefits operating rule modernizes the eligibility transaction with additional data content. It increases eligibility transaction data quality with improved granularity and specificity, as well as quantity and transparency. It requires health plans to indicate if a service, such as telehealth, is eligible for coverage and if the service requires prior authorization. In the case of telehealth, this is significant given the increase in virtual care. It allows Dr. Smith's practice in real time to find out if telehealth is covered for Mrs. Baker and schedule her appointment. The operating rule addresses the increasing complexity of benefit design. It requires health plans to include new details about a patient's coverage, including maximum benefit limitations, remaining benefits, and tiered network status via the electronic transaction instead of time-consuming, archaic, manual methods or proprietary portals. It requires health plans to provide information on coverage and patient financial responsibility for an expanded list of service types and specific procedures. As required under the No Surprises Act, this helps the physician issue a good faith estimate for self-pay care. This also increases the level of detail that will support informed conversations between physicians and their patients about the cost of care. It aligns with ongoing efforts to improve healthcare price transparency. Next slide. So
Great.
Erin will now go over the next one. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, one thing I didn't mention earlier in this presentation is according to the CAQH index, there are 25 billion eligibility transactions a year in this country. So imagine if we add all of this new information to that transaction, how much more information providers and patients will have to have a more efficient care process. The next set of rules I want to discuss are our infrastructure rules. So every set of core operating rules has an infrastructure rule for the standard that it supports. So in particular, the rules that were put forth to NCVHS and recommended were infrastructure rules for eligibility and benefits, claim status, and electronic remittance advice transactions. The requirements in the infrastructure rules are pretty similar with some adjustments depending on the type of transaction it supports. They include processing mode, so our organizations required to support real-time, batch, one or the other, or both. Response time, what is a real-time response? What is the maximum batch response time? System availability, connectivity, acknowledgements, a companion guide template, so providers know where there's consistent places to go for the same information across health plan companion guides for each of the transactions. The updates that are in the infrastructure rules that are going forward to HHS now are related to, in particular, system availability. So the original core system availability requirements were 86%, which means that whatever system, we'll use eligibility again, health plans had to have their eligibility systems up and running 86% of the time. Well, a couple of years ago, our board said 86% of the time, like this is 2019, like that's not great. And so the core participants went through a process to reevaluate what the best system availability percentage should be given the progress we've made since the rules were first implemented. And it was a really interesting discussion. Providers were ready to have 99% system availability, but health plans brought up some challenges, in particular that their systems are bigger and more complex and have a lot of dependencies that they may not have had 10 years ago. And so to take, sometimes they don't have as much control as to when and how they take a system down. So they compromised, which is kind of the art that we live in here at CORE, and agreed to increase system availability requirements to 90%, with an additional 24-hour quarterly downtime to allow for major system migrations. And 4% increase doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually, I'm not going to remember the exact number, but it's like 350 more hours a year or an hour a day. So a whole hour more a day, systems will be guaranteed to be up. We hope they're up for more than that. But that will be the base now, a new base for the industry. Additionally, these requirements also link to the updated connectivity rule, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I'll turn it over to our real world example.
Thank you. So now we're going to consider Mr. Quinn, who has a new cough and unexplained weight loss. Dr. Brown orders imaging to check for lung cancer. However, the health plan's electronic system is down. Eligibility cannot be confirmed now, and Mr. Quinn's scheduling and care are delayed. It is frustrating when health IT systems are unavailable. Patients do not stop requiring care simply because a health insurer's system is unavailable because it is down or it is outside of 9 to 5 weekday business hours. If coverage cannot be confirmed because a health plan system is unavailable, then scheduling will be delayed until practice staff can manually check the patient's benefits or when the plan system is again available. Next slide. The updated infrastructure operating rule increases required system availability, as Erin said, from 86 to 90% of the calendar week. While this is a compromise, it does allow for improved timeliness of patient care. It better recognizes that healthcare is 24/7, 365. It better allows Dr. Brown's practice to find out eligibility in real time. These updated infrastructure rules represent a major improvement from the status quo in system availability. It is imperative that physicians and their staff have reliable access to eligibility and benefits and claim status information whenever they are providing care. Increased system availability expands the opportunity for practices to check insurance coverage when the patient seeks treatment. This then would avoid practice workflow disruptions, enhance the physician practice efficiency, and improve the timeliness of patient care. Next slide. I'll pass it back to Erin.
Great. The one operating rule that is new and not an update to the set that was recommended to HHS is the single patient attribution operating rule. Patient attribution matches individual patients in a population with providers, and it's part of value-based care programs very frequently, and there's a number of different methodologies to do it. But one of the challenges we heard before developing this rule was that providers often didn't know if a patient was attributed to them until it was too late to impact care. And so the core participants developed this rule as well as 2 rules related to patient attribution roster sharing information. But this rule in particular requires that a plan send back whether or not a patient is attributed to a provider in a value-based care contract in that eligibility transaction, as well as the effective dates of the attribution, so that providers know at the time of service whether or not a patient is attributed to them. So what does that mean for providers, Marilyn?
Yeah, so here's Mr. Evans on this next slide. We have Mr. Evans who's due for a screening colonoscopy, and Dr. Rogers has a value-based contract and would like to know whether Mr. Evans is part of that panel. She is uncertain, however, if Mr. Evans is attributed to her practice. Therefore, Dr. Rogers cannot successfully participate in value-based care. So physicians need accurate, timely patient attribution information in order to successfully participate in value-based contracts. Physicians face significant challenges in obtaining actionable patient attribution data. AMA policy calls on health plans to provide attribution information to physicians in a timely manner and to note that they should offer mechanisms to allow physicians to verify and correct attribution data as necessary. Next slide. The new patient attribution operating rule offers such mechanisms as it requires health plans to provide information regarding a patient's attribution status in an electronic eligibility response. It allows practices to correct any inaccurate attributions with the health plan. Practices can more readily see if a patient is attributed for value-based care, report on quality measures, and close care gaps. As our healthcare system transitions away from traditional fee-for-service toward value-based care and other innovative payment models, timely communication of accurate patient attribution will become increasingly important. Inclusion of patient attribution data in the eligibility response will support physicians' success in value-based care. Next slide, Erin.
So I think this is our last one,
Yes.
is the newly proposed connectivity rule. The connectivity rules that are currently federally mandated were developed more than 10 years ago. And as we know, connectivity and security requirements have advanced significantly in that time frame. But this is version 4. So we have gone through a couple versions now. These operating rules really describe how the transaction can be sent between a plan and provider and create a safe harbor. So the rule requires that health plans have to support all of the requirements in the core connectivity rule. Plans can choose which SOAP or REST, which one that they prefer. But the underlying goal is that there is a single way to connect, that the industry knows everyone will be assured is supported. And the requirements have evolved over time. This latest version has added REST to support things like FHIR APIs and more stringent security requirements like XDOT 509, OAuth, and a few other things. So I'll turn it over now to talk about the real life implications of this.
Thank you, Erin. So now let's consider Dr. Filbert, who knows that physician practices must protect the security, accuracy, and integrity of a patient's health information. She wants to upgrade from an old username password authentication and prefers a more secure approach. Dr. Filbert recognizes that protected health information, or PHI, security is a concern. Physician practices are businesses that depend on the security and reliability of their health IT connections. Without this, they would lose revenue, experience increased cost, be exposed to significant liability, and suffer reputational harm. Next slide. The updated connectivity operating rule includes measures listed here to support improved security, accuracy, and integrity of PHI that physicians are responsible to protect. The new rule modernizes the authorization and authentication requirements. It better protects physicians' vital business and professional interests. It reflects modern technology advances and IT best practices and should improve interoperability in the healthcare industry. The update saves stakeholders the cost and other resources involved in maintaining outdated connectivity and security technologies. The rule provides support for exchange of electronic attachments, a key unmet business need, across stakeholder groups. So that is a priority yet to be realized. Next slide, please. We will now highlight some takeaways. Next slide. AMA studies show that there are high levels of physicians' administrative burden and burnout, factors that are linked. These adverse experiences may be mitigated by operating rules that streamline prior authorization and related business practices, as well as ensure interoperability with all of the health plans with which a practice does business. Erin?
Absolutely. You know, operating rules really help automate things and create consistency so that a provider can exchange data with multiple health plans, reducing burden, reducing costs. consistent implementation and expectations, and really maximizing the utility of the standards themselves. If we go to the next slide, for those of you on the line who are wondering, how can I get involved? The very first thing we would encourage is to become a core participant, or if your organization is already a core participant, join us at the table. This is how you get involved in the operating rule development day-to-day activities. Participate in our work groups. You can share work groups. There's opportunities for leadership roles. It's really a great forum to exchange ideas and solutions with colleagues from across the industry. Second is to become core certified. Demonstrate that your products or systems are in conformance with the operating rules. We know that many plans and some providers even require core certification as a condition of contracting. So you have that assurance that your vendor systems are in conformance with the rules. Third, be an advocate. You know, there is a lot of work being done, and the more we can amplify that and share the value of operating rules across the industry, and the more engagement we have, the better the rules that we write. And finally, you know, as we know, we are expecting an IFR in the coming weeks or months. Contribute. If you have thoughts and want to make sure that HHS is aware, we encourage you to demonstrate your support for the new rules by responding to the anticipated IFR. With that, I will turn it back over to Jackie for some Q&A.
Thanks, Erin. If we just jump ahead, I think 2 slides, just a reminder, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to submit them now. You should have a questions section in your GoToWebinar menu on that right-hand side of your screen. I didn't see any questions come through yet, but we did have one submitted ahead of time. So you mentioned earlier the operating rules and their process for federal mandate. And the question is, what can people do until those rules receive the official HHS mandate?
That's a really great question. So even though the rules are not federally mandated, they are available for voluntary implementation, as nothing is stopping industry from implementing these operating rules now, or any of the core operating rules. So I would encourage organizations to get started in their planning processes. Core certification will be available on these rules early next year, so that you can get your seal and be ahead of the curve. I think our team is available to help support that process and your understanding of the requirements. And so that, I think that would be a great way to start.
Great, thanks, Erin. I haven't seen any other questions come through, and I know we're a bit early on time, but is there anything else you wanted to add before we signed off?
No, I think everyone appreciates a few extra minutes in their day. I just want to thank Dr. Heine again for joining us today and supporting our work, as well as the AMA. So thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you so much. Always great to work with you. And thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.